You've probably forgotten most of what you learned in school, the names of historical figures you memorized for tests, the formulas you studied for exams, the definitions you repeated until they stuck, until they didn't. Most of it's gone now, faded, inaccessible. Your brain decided it wasn't worth keeping. But there are some stories you've never forgotten. Stories you heard once, maybe as a child, and they just stayed. David and Goliath, the boy with 5 stones facing a giant. You can picture it, the Good Samaritan, a stranger helping someone everyone else ignored. You know how it goes. Jonah and the whale, 3 days in the belly of a fish, still there. You might not be religious, might not have opened a religious text in years or ever, but these stories are still in your head, complete, intact, ready to be recalled. And here's what's strange. They're not particularly complex. They're not brilliant literature. Many of them are quite simple. So why do they stay when everything else fades? Why are religious stories so easy to remember? Before we keep going, if this kind of quiet thinking is your thing, you might want to subscribe to Belief Explained Simply. These videos move slowly, sit with questions, and don't rush to conclusions. And if you know someone who enjoys conversations like this, feel free to share it with them. All right, let's keep going. Let's notice something about the stories that stick. They have a particular shape. They're short. Most can be told in under 2 minutes, some in 30 seconds. They have clear characters: a giant, a Samaritan, a prodigal son, a shepherd. Simple, archetypal, easy to visualize. They have stakes. Someone is in danger. Someone needs help. Someone is lost. Someone faces a choice. They have movement. Something happens. A boy picks up stones. A man crosses the road. A son leaves home. Actions, not ideas. And they have a point. Not always a moral, but a weight. Something that feels significant even if you can't articulate why. This is not accidental structure. This is engineered structure. Not consciously, necessarily, but refined over thousands of years of telling and retelling. The stories that survived are the ones people could remember, the ones they wanted to retell, the ones that stuck. Everything else got forgotten. Here's what makes this interesting. These stories weren't written to be memorable. They were written or spoken first, then written to convey meaning, to teach, to inspire, to warn. But the ones that actually survived are the ones that fit how human memory works. Not how we wish memory worked, how it actually works. Psychologists call this narrative memory. We don't remember data well, we don't remember abstract concepts well, we don't even remember experiences particularly well, but we remember stories, because stories have structure, and structure creates hooks, hooks that let your brain file the story somewhere retrievable. A beginning, a middle, an end, cause and effect, problem and resolution. That structure is a mnemonic device, not added artificially, built into the form. Let's compare 2 ways of communicating the same idea. Version 1. We should help people regardless of their social status or ethnic background. That's a principle. It's true. It's important. But can you remember it word for word? Probably not. Can you visualize it? No. Is it easy to retell to someone else? Not really. Version 2. A man is beaten and left on the road. A priest walks by. A Levite walks by. A Samaritan, someone from a despised group, stops, helps, pays for his care. That's the same principle. But now it's a story. And you can see it, you can remember it, you can tell it to someone else years later, even if you've only heard it once. The story does something the principle can't. It creates images, it creates sequence, it creates emotional engagement, and all of that makes it unforgettable. Here's another layer. Religious stories use repetition, not just repetition across retellings, repetition within the story itself. The prodigal son. The younger son asks for his inheritance, the younger son leaves. The younger son wastes his money. The younger son ends up feeding pigs. The younger son returns. Younger son, younger son, younger son. That repetition is doing something. It's drilling the character into your memory. It's creating a rhythm, a pattern. 3 is particularly common. 3 wishes, 3 sons, 3 denials, 3 days. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Jonah is in the whale 3 days. Jesus is tempted 3 times in the desert. Why 3? Because 3 is the minimum number for pattern. 1 is an instance, 2 is a coincidence, 3 is a pattern, and patterns are easier to remember than randomness. Your brain is a pattern recognition machine. It's constantly looking for structure, for predictability, for repetition. Religious stories give it exactly that. Let's notice something else. These stories use concrete images, not abstractions. They don't say perseverance. They show a shepherd searching for one lost sheep. They don't say betrayal. They show 30 pieces of silver and a kiss. They don't say resurrection. They show an empty tomb and grave clothes folded. Images stick. Abstractions don't. If I say justice, you might understand the concept, but can you picture it? Not really. If I say a man measuring grain carefully, making sure both buyer and seller get exactly what they're owed, now you can see it. Now it's memorable. Religious texts do this constantly. They embed concepts in images, and images create memory, because your brain doesn't store ideas as words. It stores them as simulations. As little movies it can replay. Abstract language doesn't create a movie. Concrete imagery does. Here's where it gets more interesting. Religious stories also use emotional resonance. Not just any emotion, specific emotions that are particularly memorable. Fear, awe, shame, relief, gratitude. The emotions that matter for survival. The emotions that shaped us evolutionarily. Cain kills Abel, that's fear, violence, danger. Your brain pays attention to that. Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac, that's horror, then relief. Your brain remembers that. The walls of Jericho fall, that's awe, power beyond comprehension. Your brain files that. Emotions tag memories. They mark them as important. They create retrieval cues. A boring story told with perfect grammar is forgotten. A simple story that makes you feel something stays forever. Religious stories understood this, not intellectually, but through trial and error, through what survived retelling, long before psychology could explain why. Let's sit with another pattern. Many religious stories are counterintuitive. They violate expectations. The last shall be first. The meek shall inherit. A rich man can't enter heaven. Losing your life to save it. These ideas don't make immediate sense. They create cognitive dissonance, a little friction in your mind, and that friction makes them memorable, because your brain notices things that don't fit, things that violate patterns, things that seem wrong but are presented as right. If a story confirms what you already think, it slides right past. Nothing to grab onto. But if a story challenges your assumptions, even subtly, it sticks, because your brain has to work to process it, and that work creates memory. The prodigal son who wastes everything gets a party. The responsible son who stayed gets nothing. That's not fair, that's not how it should work, and that's exactly why you remember it. Here's another thing worth noticing. Religious stories often have a sensory quality. You don't just hear about events. You hear descriptions that engage multiple senses. The widow's mite. You can hear the coins clinking into the temple treasury, feeding the 5,000. You can see the baskets of fish and bread. You can imagine the crowd sitting on grass, Jesus writing in the dirt. You can see the finger moving, feel the tension in the air. Sensory details make stories vivid, and vividness creates memorability. If I tell you someone gave generously, you might understand. If I tell you a widow put in 2 small copper coins, all she had to live on, you can see it, hear it, feel the weight of those coins. Sensory language creates mental simulation, and mental simulation creates lasting memory. Now let's look at structure more carefully. Many religious stories follow what's called the hero's journey, or similar archetypal patterns. Someone faces a problem, they go on a journey, they're tested, they return changed. Moses in the desert, Jesus in the wilderness, the prodigal son leaving and returning, Jonah running from his calling and being redirected. This structure appears across cultures, across religions, across time, not because everyone copied it, but because it maps onto something fundamental about human experience. We all face problems, we all resist, we all get tested, we all hopefully learn and change. The structure resonates because it mirrors life. And things that mirror life are easier to remember because they connect to your own experience. The story becomes a lens for understanding your own story. Here's something else that's worth sitting with. Religious stories are social. They're told in community. They're referenced in conversation. They're shared across generations. That social dimension creates reinforcement. You don't just hear the story of David and Goliath once. You hear it referenced when someone talks about facing impossible odds. You hear it in metaphors. You see it in art, in movies, in cultural references. Every repetition strengthens the memory. And because the story is simple and structured, each retelling is consistent. You're not hearing 17 different versions that confuse the memory. You're hearing the same core narrative that reinforces the pattern. Social memory is stronger than individual memory. When a story is held by a community, it persists in ways personal memories don't. The community becomes the storage device, and you tap into it every time the story is referenced. Let's notice one more pattern. Religious stories often have a certain incompleteness. They leave gaps. What was Jonah thinking inside the whale? What did the prodigal son say to his brother later? What happened to the Good Samaritan afterward? We don't know. The story doesn't say. And that incompleteness is actually a feature, not a bug, because gaps invite participation. They make your brain fill in the missing pieces. And when you participate in constructing the story, you own it more deeply. It becomes partly yours, not just something you received, but something you co-created. And co-created memories are stronger than passive ones. The story leaves room for you. And that's part of why it stays. Here's where this gets uncomfortable. If religious stories are easy to remember because they're engineered, consciously or unconsciously, to fit how memory works, does that mean they're manipulative? Does it mean they're just good storytelling with no deeper truth? Or does it mean that truth, to be transmitted across generations, has to be packaged in memorable form? Maybe all three. Maybe the stories that survived did so precisely because they could be remembered. And maybe part of why they could be remembered is because they're well-crafted. And maybe well-crafted doesn't mean false. It just means effective at doing what stories do. Sticking in minds, being retold, carrying meaning across time. Let's look at what happens when you try to remember things that aren't structured as stories. Religious texts have laws, long lists of rules, detailed genealogies, complex theological arguments. Most people can't remember any of that. Even devout believers struggle to remember the 10 Commandments in order. The genealogies in Matthew, completely forgotten by most. But the stories, those stay. Because lists don't create narrative, genealogies don't create emotion, arguments don't create images. The parts of religious texts that persist in memory are the parts that follow narrative structure, the parts that create mental movies, the parts that engage emotion and pattern recognition. Everything else requires rereading, study, external aids. The stories just live in your head. Here's another angle. Children remember religious stories particularly well, not because children are more spiritual, but because children think in stories. Before abstract reasoning fully develops, children understand the world through narrative, through characters, through actions and consequences. Share your toys is abstract, hard to remember, doesn't connect. But there was a boy who had 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread, and he shared them, and everyone got fed. That's concrete. That's memorable. That connects. Religious education has always known this, even if it couldn't explain why. Tell children stories. Simple, vivid, with clear characters and clear stakes. And those stories will stay with them into adulthood, even if they forget everything else. Because the stories were designed or evolved to be remembered by the least sophisticated memory systems, which means they work for everyone. Let's notice something about how these stories are transmitted. They're oral before they're written. Even after being written down, they continue to be spoken. Read aloud, performed, chanted, sung. Oral transmission has different requirements than written transmission. You can't look back at a previous page when you're listening. You can't pause to think. You have to remember in real time. So oral stories develop features that aid memory. Rhythm, repetition, formulaic phrases, clear structure, vivid imagery, all the things we've been noticing. Religious stories were shaped by thousands of years of being spoken, being passed from mouth to ear to mouth. The ones that survived that process are the ones that worked for oral memory. And even now, when they're written, they retain those oral features, which is why hearing them read aloud often feels more powerful than reading them silently. They were made for the ear, for the voice, for the mind that receives through listening. Here's something else worth considering. Many religious stories are scalable. They work at different levels of interpretation. A child hears David and Goliath and gets small person defeats big person through courage. An adult hears it and gets faith overcomes impossible odds. A scholar might hear it and get theological commentary on divine intervention and human agency. Same story, different depths, and that scalability aids memory because the story grows with you. It stays relevant at different life stages. You don't outgrow it. You find new things in it, and every time you find something new, you reinforce the basic structure. The memory deepens rather than fades. Let's return to the original question. Why are religious stories easy to remember? Not because they're divinely inspired to be unforgettable, though believers might see it that way, and not because they're cynically designed to manipulate, though skeptics might frame it that way, but because over thousands of years, the stories that fit how human memory works survived, and the ones that didn't fit got forgotten. It's a kind of natural selection. Mimetic evolution. The stories that could be remembered got retold. The stories that got retold became canonical. The stories that became canonical shaped cultures. And now, thousands of years later, you can still picture David picking up 5 smooth stones. Still see the prodigal son walking home. Still imagine Jonah in the darkness of the whale. Not because you tried to memorize them, but because they were designed, by process, by iteration, by survival, to be unforgettable. Here's the uncomfortable part. If you're not religious, these stories are still in your head, still shaping how you think, still providing metaphors and reference points. David and Goliath means something even if you don't believe the story literally happened. Good Samaritan is in the language, in the culture, in the conceptual vocabulary. Prodigal Son describes a pattern everyone recognizes. The stories escaped their original context. They became cultural infrastructure, shared mental models, and you absorbed them whether you meant to or not. Because they're memorable, because they're everywhere, because they're built to stick. And if you are religious, maybe this is unsettling in a different way. Because if the stories are memorable due to psychological and narrative principles, does that reduce them? Does explaining the mechanism diminish the meaning? Or does it just reveal that meaning to persist across generations? Requires form. That truth needs a vehicle, and narrative is the vehicle that works. The stories are effective because they're well-crafted. But well-crafted doesn't mean empty. It means functional. A bridge is well-engineered. That doesn't make it less real. It makes it capable of bearing weight. Maybe religious stories are the same, engineered by trial and survival and iteration to bear the weight of meaning across time. You've probably forgotten most of what you learned in school, but you still remember the stories, the ones with clear characters, with stakes, with movement, with images you can see, the ones that made you feel something, the ones that violated your expectations slightly, the ones with patterns and repetition, the ones that worked with your memory, not against it. And maybe that's the point. Not that religious stories are magic, but that they're masterfully adapted to the medium they travel through, human minds. They fit the grooves, follow the contours, work with the grain of how we remember. Not by accident. By surviving thousands of years of retelling, the forgettable stories died. The memorable ones are still here, and they're still in your head, whether you're trying to remember them or not. You probably know more religious stories than you realize. Not because you studied them, but because they studied you. They learned how your memory works, and they shaped themselves to fit, and now they're just there, complete, intact, ready to be recalled. Even the ones you don't believe, even the ones you've never read, even the ones you think you've forgotten. They're waiting, structured, patterned, vivid, emotional, incomplete enough to invite you in, simple enough to remember, complex enough to grow with you. Maybe that's not coincidence. Maybe that's design, not by any single author, but by time, by use, by the test of transmission. The stories that survived are the ones that could be remembered. And the ones that could be remembered are the ones that understood something fundamental about how minds work, which raises a question. Are we remembering the stories, or are the stories remembering us? If this raised something for you, an agreement, a disagreement, or even just a question, you're welcome to share it in the comments. Not answers, just what this brought up for you. I read them. Please subscribe, like, and share. This helps us grow and create more interesting content like this one.